Hello everyone. My name is Aditya Patawari and I am founder of Devops Nexus. We are a small consulting company where we help various companies understand the gaps in their infrastructure and help them scale. We do a bunch of cloud and Docker related stuff. Today I'm going to talk about Ansible. Ansible is a configuration management and an orchestration tool. Now, a lot of you have shared that you have not actually used a configuration management tool before. So this puts us in a good position because that's what we're going to do. We're going to learn a little bit about Ansible. The topics that I'm going to cover today are basically I'm going to give you a little introduction about how configuration management or Ansible works in general, and then we are going to go and set up a multi-tier application using Ansible. So when we talk about certain things, certain challenges that we have as a system administrator, as a systems engineer, or essentially as a DevOps person, we can probably say that we do a lot of repetitive tasks, just like the mouse who's stuck in a wheel. There are new servers which come in every day. There are new applications that need to be set up, and those servers and those applications need to be updated constantly due to new features, bug patches, releases, whatever. And there are cases where we have cloud-based infrastructure. Sometimes we have co-located data centers. Sometimes we use a combination of both to get best out of both. Now, ideally, our setup should be done in such a way that it should be able to manage both cloud and co-located data centers. Another problem that system administrators or DevOps persons usually face is that initial configuration is typically the first server is configured manually, and then those steps somebody forgets to record them, and when you have to set up the same server again for scaling or for whatever reason, then it becomes a big problem. So management and replication of the same server or service is a huge problem which people try to handle in their own ways. And then, of course, there are new people coming in. There are people leaving off the organization, and due to that, you have to several times, make sure that the credentials are up to date, your access is revoked when people leave, and so on. And essentially, if you do not automate these tasks, you will keep on doing that again and again. And that is what a good configuration management tool will help you address. So the solutions that typically people have when they just start, the first is always manual setup. And if you're a very small organization, if you have just 2 or 3 servers, then probably you will think that, hey, I don't need it. Manual setup is good enough. You'll probably write the steps in a wiki or in an email and then mail it to your teammates, or just keep it in drafts as a record. Eventually, you will probably try to write a script to automate all that. But the problem with scripts is that it becomes a scaling nightmare. And these scripts are general purpose, they're not designed to manage infrastructure. So there are certain things that won't be easy for you to script. And in the end, the idea is that you should be able to sleep with confidence in a peaceful manner. And really the infrastructure setup should not be a sleep blocker. So when you talk about scripts, there are a few reasons why scripts fail to scale. Scripts become essentially very complicated and dirty when they exceed a certain number of lines. So if you have looked at a shell script of over 1,000 lines, then it becomes a problem. So when you look at a script of over 1,000 lines, then it becomes a problem. Now, and that thing goes to 50 lines for Perl. Scripts, because they're not designed for scripts are not designed for infrastructure specifically. So at a lot of places you need to do multiple. You need to create similar things. Multiple code repetition will be there. You need to create the same function to do the same thing at a lot of locations, which is not ideal. Another thing is that it's sometimes hard to remember the order of execution with scripts. So for example, if you have a service A which is dependent on service B, then you always have to make sure that you manually remember that you have to set up service B before you set up service A. And that at times again becomes a problem because then you have to document everything. And lastly, documentation itself is a problem because, well, engineers don't like to document. While documentation is a must for a good infrastructure, a lot of times somebody drops the ball and we forget to document it. So scripts become a problem to handle situations in those cases. Now, configuration management tools help address these problems, and there are a bunch of them out there. Ansible is one of them. I've listed these in alphabetical order. Ansible, Chef, Puppet, and Salt. These are some of the most popular, most common configuration management tools. All of them are battle tested, and I've personally seen them running and managing a few thousand hosts. So they are very good. But today we are specifically going to talk about Ansible. Why do I pick Ansible? These are some of the biggest reason why I have chosen Ansible for this. Ansible is written in YAML. So Ansible configurations are written in YAML, which makes it really easy to read. Unlike Puppet and Chef, which have their own DSL, so there's a certain learning curve when you go through Puppet and Chef because you have to understand and learn their DSL. But YAML is as simple as plain English, and we will see that as we go ahead. The second one is that Ansible uses OpenSSH as transport. So we already know that that is something which has been tried and tested over a long period of time. We are confident about the security of OpenSSH. And OpenSSH is something which is available on all the hosts that we set up. Unlike other transport mechanisms like messaging queues and all, where you explicitly have to set up the queue. Ansible also does parallel ordered execution. Now, if you talk about a couple of years back, or probably if you are on an older version of, let's say, Puppet, then parallel ordered execution is a big problem because Puppet will not execute the task in a ordered fashion. Any task can execute after any other task. Now this becomes a problem because again the dependencies, either you have to define manually that task A depends on task B, which is again something which sometimes people forget. Um, Unlike in Ansible, if you have written something in a certain order, it will be executed in that order. So that helps in managing the services and the dependencies. And lastly, uh, there are no agents required if you are using Ansible. If you're using any other configuration management tool like Puppet or Chef, then on each server you actually need to install Puppet agent or Chef agent. In Ansible, you don't need to do that. All you need is a Python library, which is already shipped with all the Linux distributions. So basically, as soon as your operating system is up and running, you're good to use Ansible. Now, the problem, why I'm highlighting this is that it actually gives rise to a very interesting paradox where you can think like this, that your configuration management tool is supposed to set up the first few steps. It's supposed to take care of the entire server life cycle. Now, if it is supposed to take care of entire server life cycle, then who is supposed to install that agent? Now that becomes an open question, that how we will get the agent there. Then you'll have to probably introduce another tool to get the agent there first, and then you'd be able to use Puppet or Chef. In Ansible, that's not a requirement, so that's very helpful. All right. Installing Ansible, it's really simple. All you need to do is probably use your operating system's default package manager like yum or apt, and you're good to go. If your package manager does not have Ansible, then you can also use Python pip. The basic deal here is that if you can SSH to a server, then you can run Ansible on that server. So let's say if I have a web server, I can SSH to that server, and if I want to manage that using Ansible, then I can do that. There's no other agent required. There are no credentials, separate credentials, or any permissions required. As long as I can SSH, I'm good to go. Yeah, so basically I don't need any separate ACLs. I can run scripted as well as ad hoc stuff. So with this, I'm just going to go and start with demo. So in demo, we are going to set up we're going to set up a LAMP application, basically a two-tier where we have a separate database server and a separate Apache PHP server. Now, before we do that, I just quickly want to introduce a couple of concepts. First is inventory file. Basically, inventory file is a file which tells Ansible where to find particular set of servers. So let's say if I want to set up something on web servers, then I'll just create a group called web servers, and that's the one which has the square brackets. And then I'll list down all the web servers under that heading. Similarly, I can define databases, I can define SMTPs, and so on. Good thing to note about here is that if there is a single server which performs multiple tasks, then you can have the same server across various headings. So if I have one big server which has web servers as well as databases, I can write the same name under both the headings. While this is not recommended, this is certainly possible. All right, let me just quickly get started with the demo that I have. All right. Okay. Okay, so first thing that we need to do here is we need to make sure that we have the required infrastructure. Now, there is an advantage of using Ansible is that basically you can actually interact with the cloud provider itself. So since we are using DigitalOcean, we can actually create our infrastructure using the DigitalOcean module. Here in DigitalOcean module, I have basically created an API token. This is the API token this is the API token to interact with DigitalOcean. This can be obtained from the DigitalOcean dashboard. So now let us look at the first playbook that we have here. All right. So as I said, that Ansible uses YAML format. What I'm going to do here is these are a few key things that we need to know when we create a YAML. The first line of YAML has to start with 3 dashes. Once we have the 3 dashes in place, then there are few things that we need to put in place in a particular playbook. A playbook is basically a collection of tasks that are going to execute on a particular set of hosts. So we need to define what host we are going to execute the task on. Here I have set the host as local. This means that in my inventory, the playbook is going to find the local group and going to execute this task against that. Now the tasks in this playbook are as follows. The first one is, this is how basically we define a task. If you look at this particular highlighted section, that's a task. Now a task can optionally have a name. A name is for us to understand what the task does. Ansible does not read this, so you can even ignore if you want. I would strongly discourage that, because this really helps understanding what the particular task is doing. Now, after that, there is a DigitalOcean. After we define the name of the task, there's a DigitalOcean module that we are going to use. So module name comes immediately after the name of the task. So we are going to use DigitalOcean module. Once we decide what module we have to use, we're going to define certain parameters which are required for us to do the task. Now the task actually requires us to put this public key and name it webinar. Basically, this public key will be uploaded to DigitalOcean against the name webinar, and we can use this key to authenticate the droplets that we are going to create at a later stage. Every task for DigitalOcean module requires the API key, API token. Here is the API token. Now, if you look at this particular section, which I'm highlighting now, it has two parentheses and then DO API token. Now, this is how we define a variable. This is known as Jinja templating. Now, a variable basically helps us in keeping the data separate, because I can now share this playbook with people, but I don't have to share my token with people. So that helps here. DigitalOcean model. So Ansible has a lot of modules inbuilt. You don't need to install DigitalOcean modules separately. If you go to web probably, and let me quickly show you a few modules. Ansible comes with a lot of modules inbuilt. If you look at this, the modules are categorized into these few categories, and since we are using DigitalOcean model, that will be present in cloud modules. And if you look here, there are a bunch of cloud modules available. Right, so we have the DigitalOcean module here. The DigitalOcean module basically create and delete a droplet and SSH key in DigitalOcean. Right, you can find a lot of modules, and all these modules are basically inbuilt. You don't need to install them separately. Now going back to demo, right, so I just want to upload this public key to DigitalOcean and name it webinar. This will help me in authenticating the next few droplets that I'm going to create. So basically, I'm going to create a database droplet like this. The database droplet, I have to define certain parameters. I want the database droplet to be present. If I set this to absent, if there's an existing droplet, that will be deleted. The command that I want to execute is droplet. That's because I'm doing a droplet based operation. The name of the droplet, this is the name that will be set on DigitalOcean dashboard. So you can set it to a well-defined name, database, since we are using the database. An API token. Size, I just want a small droplet because this is for the demo. But if you are on a production-like setup, then I would suggest you guys to put this in order of a few gigabytes, depending upon how much your requirement is. Region ID, Bangalore 1. I'm going to use CentOS image. Wait timeout, this is basically to make, because as soon as the command is executed, it takes a few seconds or up to a minute for droplet to be there, and the timeout will help ensure that it actually waits that much. SSH key ID, this ID is basically of the same key that we uploaded in the task before, right? If you look at, if this ID belongs to this particular key already. And lastly, whatever the output of this particular module would be, I want that output to be registered in this particular variable called db droplet. The reason of doing that is because I will use this particular variable to fetch the IP address of this machine in this task. All right. So if you look at this, it's going to print a message database machines IP, and then using this template, Jinja template variable, I'm going to get the IP of the droplet. Similarly, I'm going to create another droplet, and that would be for the application, where I'm going to name this task as create app droplet, and then using DigitalOcean module, I'm just going to basically do similar steps again, right? And in the end, I'm going to register the output of this particular task in this variable called app droplet, and then I'm going to basically print that output. Sounds good? All right. Uh, Let me just go out. Right. So now what we have to do is execute this. Just in case you're wondering that where I'm getting those variables from, let me remind you quickly that inventory actually has all these variables. So DO API token is the variable that I was using to fetch my API token, which is this one. And local is my local host. All right. So basically, the DO playbook will execute on my local host from that machine, from my local host. This is going to give a call to DigitalOcean API server using this particular API token, and then going to execute the operations that I wanted to execute. All right, so let us just do that. Right, now if you see in these brackets, these are the names that I put. So these names actually help identify what particular task is executing right now. So this is right now trying to create the database droplet. It's going to take a minute before the droplets are created and I get the IPs. In the meanwhile, if you guys have any questions, please feel free. All right, a couple of questions I'm going to answer. Okay, let's start with okay. Um, wow, okay, too many questions. Are you creating a droplet on localhost? No. So basically, what is happening here is that the task is executing on my local host, but it is actually connecting to the DigitalOcean API. The reason is that DigitalOcean module is there on my local host, right? So it's gonna get the API keys and then connect to DigitalOcean API server and basically send it commands to start the particular droplets that I want. This is not actually creating droplets on my local host. That's not how it works. It just basically communicates from my local host to the DigitalOcean API server. Okay, each module has enough documentation to begin with. This is something I think I'm actually extremely happy about because Ansible's documentation is actually top notch. You can pick any module that you want or from the Ansible website. Not only every module has enough documentation, every module actually has examples on how to do things. So basically, yeah, just go ahead, search for Ansible module, DigitalOcean, or a bunch of other modules that we are going to see in this session, and you can not only see the different parameters that are supported along with an explanation. You can also see um, a few examples that will help you understand the concepts even better. Okay, are you executing the script in the same environment? I have just booted. Yeah, I'm executing. I'm sorry, I didn't get this question. Basically, I'm executing the script on my local machine because from my local machine, the connection is created to remote machine. I don't need to actually log in into the machines manually that I want to manage. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please put some clarification, I think. Uh, do you have any virtual machine running? No, I don't have any machine running right now. Uh, do you recommend running Ansible from a dedicated server? Yes, that is something that I do recommend, that you should probably run Ansible from a dedicated server. Actually, this is not required, but this is something that you should do. And that again is a personal recommendation. Why I recommend you to do so is because um, it helps you, fine tune your firewall rules, because people move around, and sometimes what happens is that I am in a remote network and my IP might not be whitelisted and so on. Another thing is that you can really control the kind of things, the versioning of the Ansible code itself, and a bunch of other things if you're on a central server. Um, and everyone gets a consistent version of Ansible. Otherwise, it might be possible that somebody is on Ansible 2.2, somebody is on 2.0, and somebody is on 1.8, and both of them will have, I mean, all of them will have different experiences if they are not on a centralized server. Again, this is not required. You can actually run Ansible from any machine. There's no central server requirement, but that's something which I would recommend. Now, last one, another one is that Ansible Tower. Yeah, Ansible Tower and Ansible. So Ansible Tower is basically a pretty UI, and nothing else. Whatever I'm showing you command line, Ansible Tower does the same thing. It just presents a better UI to it, and it's a paid offering. So if you want to have, uh, it'll help you understand that when Ansible was run on last machine and all those things, with a dashboard and all. So if you want that sort of views, then probably get a subscription of Tower. Otherwise, this is good enough. From configuration management standpoint, there's no difference as such. You will get the same experience. All right, so both our machines are up. So what I'm going to do is that I have a database machine and I have an app machine. I'm going to copy the IP address of both the machines and put in my inventory. All right, let's do this. All right. Along with now that I've put the IP addresses, I also want you to have a look at the variables that I've defined here. For database, I have a MySQL root password variable, as well as a specific password variable, which is MySQL Nextcloud password, which is a basically less privileged user. That's what we should use in application. We should not use the root credentials in the application. That's what we're going to do here. As for the application, we have an HTTP port defined. Basically, this is where we're going to serve the application. I have a domain defined, which is where we are going to basically have a look at, our basically our application. And then lastly, I have the MySQL host, which is basically the IP of the database. All right. Uh, okay, somebody has said that IP address is not correct. Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. All right. So with this, first thing that we're going to do is start setting up MySQL. So I'm quickly going to show you the MySQL playbook. Now, if you notice, before I show this to you, the DO playbook that I showed you, that single playbook had basically the host definition where I said local, and that had all the tasks written in it. Now, for small playbooks, that's acceptable. But when you actually have a huge infrastructure to manage, having a single file with all the tasks can be overwhelming, as well as it doesn't promote inheritance like concept. So basically, if you have defined a task somewhere, if required, you should be able to get that task in other playbooks as well. So what to do in this case is what I'm going to show you now. Now, if you look here is, I have defined the host as database, which is the same name as we had in inventory. But instead of tasks, I have said that I'm going to apply a role to it. And that role would be MySQL. All right. Now, what is this role thing? The role basically says that rather than having all the configurations, tasks, files, and everything in a single playbook, we are actually going to break it down. So now let us have a look at roles. First of all, I'm going to show you. Yep. So if you look in this role, this has two things. One is tasks and one is templates. All right. So both of them have specific use cases. Now tasks is where we define the tasks, just like we defined for the DO playbook, and templates is where we define Jinja templates. To understand this better, let me just show you the templates quickly. Right? So yeah, so this is a particular template. Now this variable, it's going to automatically get populated when we actually run this particular playbook. Advantage of doing so is that now I can share my roles without actually sharing the credentials of my MySQL. This also helps in promoting uh, certain things in an organization. For example, if you have multiple environments, let's say staging, pre-production, production, and so on, and all of them have different MySQL passwords, then you basically don't need to create separate templates for each of the environments. You can basically have something like this, wherein there is a variable, and then you can populate that variable on the fly, depending upon what kind of environment that is. All right. So now that we have looked at the template, let's have a look at the tasks. So by default, main.yaml is what will be executed when you import a role. If you want to segregate it further, you can have a few more things, abc.yaml, xyz.yaml, but those you have to explicitly import in the main.yaml. Since we have just the main.yaml, that's not a problem for us. Now, this again is a YAML file, which means that it starts with three dashes, like I mentioned, and then each task will have a name. Again, having a name is not mandatory, but it's helpful. And then we are going to define the things that we are going to do. Now, MySQL is basically replaced by MariaDB server, which is a community fork of MySQL. However, all the binaries and commands remain the same. So since it's compatible, we are going to use the MySQL module itself. Now, yum module, basically I want to use yum to install MariaDB server, and then I want to use systemd to start the MariaDB. All right. I also want to install MySQL Python. MySQL Python is basically required for Ansible to manage the MySQL setup. So before actually calling any of the MySQL modules from here, I'll basically do an install of MySQL Python. Now, with databases, the first thing that you should do is set the root password so that people cannot exploit your root. Now, there's a MySQL user module which will help me set the password, and I'm going to set it for all the hosts. This particular MySQL root password variable, this is going to get populated from, yeah, this is going to get populated from the inventory file. Once I've set the root password, I'm basically going to set the myCNF. Now, setting myCNF is actually required because now that root has a password, subsequent set of MySQL modules will not be able to execute unless you supply it with password. Now, supplying the password within the module might have some security issues, so we can set a CNF my.cnf, so we don't have to specify passwords from the next call. Now, next one is I'm going to use MySQL DB module to create a new database called Nextcloud. All right. And then I'm going to use MySQL user module again to create an unprivileged user which has permission to work only with this particular database called Nextcloud. All right. It cannot create new users. It cannot, interact with any other databases in my MySQL setup. So this is good from security standpoint. This again will set up the password from the inventory file. All right. Let me go ahead and execute this. All right, so the installation has begun. Oh, okay. I think I missed one question when I was answering before. The question is that using Ansible to manage Windows Server using domain user credentials without success. So let me tell you something beforehand, that while Windows is supported in Ansible, the support I personally have found is not that awesome. And there are times when Ansible lacks a few things in terms of Windows support. Best bet here you have is to probably escalate it to the community and talk to them. I have specifically not worked with domain user credentials, so I'm not really sure if that feature is working or not. But if it is not working, then I'm really sorry. I think you should basically put it forward to the community. Another question is, can the inventory be automatically updated instead of copy paste? The answer to that is actually a next topic, which I will answer your question when we are going to talk about dynamic inventory. All right, so our database is set up. Let's also look at the application playbook that we have. Now, this is something different. If you look at this particular playbook, it has 3 roles in it. Instead of just one, which MySQL had, now I'm having more than one role. Why so? Because when you set up an application, if you think about it, you do actually a bunch of tasks. If it's a web application, then you need a web server. You probably need a runtime like Rails or PHP or whatever. You need to get the code for your application. You basically might need other libraries, like for example, if your application uses Redis or Memcache, then you might need separate libraries for them, and so on. So rather than having everything in a single playbook, in a single role, we are actually going to break it down even further and have multiple roles, and then we are going to call all those roles in that application. playbook. All right. So let's start. Another thing that you should notice here is that these particular roles will be executed in a particular order. So let's start with the first one, which is HTTPD. Uh, so HTTPD actually has now 3 directories. Along with tasks and templates, we also have a handler. Now, what is a handler? Handler is actually similar to task in the sense that it is defined in the same way, but they are actually specialized tasks, right? If you look at this, this is similar to what it was, what a task was. The only catch here is that handlers are to be called. They do not execute by default. A task need to call a handler, and then handler will be executed at the end of the execution of the playbook. All right. So let's see. Let's go to the tasks. Sorry. Right. So if you look here, I'm using yum to install HTTPD, and I'm then setting the HTTPD config. But as soon as the config is set in this area, I'm basically going to ask this particular task to notify. Now this notify basically notifies the handler, and I'm going to tell it to notify the handler named restart HTTPD. So as soon as we have a configuration update, we need to restart the web server. All right. And let's just have a quick look at the template as well. Template is standard HTTPD configuration. One thing to note here is that we are actually calling 2 variables from the inventory called domain and HTTP port. Sounds good? Okay. Let's quickly have a look at other roles as well. So along with HTTPD, we have a PHP role. Here I'm basically enabling EPL repository as well as webstatic repository. Webstatic repository helps in getting the latest PHP packages. Now, one thing that you have to note here is that ideally this should have been done in 2 tasks, right? But if we have a lot of similar things to be done, we can actually use looping. So I can define a variable called item here, and then I can use this particular loop with items. So basically it's going to iterate for every line present here. Every element of this particular array will be iterated. Similarly, if you look at this particular task, now I want to install packages. There are total 8 packages here. Now, if I don't use loops, I have to create 8 separate tasks.
Hey everyone, looks like a slight audio issue with Aditya's on end. He's trying to fix.
Am I audible now?
Yes, yes,
Am I
Aditya.
audible now?
There's a slight echo.
Um, is the echo still on? Is the echo still on? Is there hello? Is there an echo? Okay. Right. So I was talking about. I'm talking about the Nextcloud task. So far we have gotten the web server and the runtime in place. Now we need to get the code of the application. So if you look at this particular task, this exactly does that. What is an open source project which basically helps you? Am I audible now? All right. So OnCloud is, Nextcloud is basically open source application which helps you sync your files across various devices. And that's what we are going to try to set up. Uh, to do that, we are going to use Yelp to install bzip2. The reason of installing bzip2 is because we are going to download the bzip2 archive, which is going to set up, which is what we're going to set up. Using the get URL module, I'm going to download this particular archive, which has the application code. Once I have the archive, I'm going to use unarchive module, and I'm going to extract this particular archive to this destination. And I'm going to set the owner of this particular extracted directory as Apache because that's what our application user is. Now, I'm also going to notify the restart HTTP handler because as and when we have application code updated, we basically want to restart the web server. Actually, you can use reload. This is just I'm using this for demo, but you can use reload. And lastly, I'm going to use the template. This is an application specific template, which is basically to configure the application to connect it to the database. And after that, we are going to set the permission of this directory to Apache user. Now, let's just quickly go and run our application playbook. All right. There are a few questions. If I'm using a bare metal server, then how can I SSH? Okay, in that case, no, you cannot use Ansible without having SSH key in place. Um, there are ways to do that. For example, when you set up your operating system for the first time, usually your data center provider will set up the keys for you to log into, to actually do that. SSH, if you have password and not the SSH key, then that is fine as well. But you need some form of SSH authentication. Passwords, keys, or any form of SSH authentication will work. Will you be sharing these files at the end of the session? Yes. So this entire thing is already open sourced. I have this demo up. Let me just quickly show you where. Yeah. So this is the URL of the demo. You can basically take this. Can we change the SSH protocol and port? Yes, you can do that. That is not a problem. All right. So this has finished up. Now what we can do here is that our application is up and running. Those who are on a Linux-based systems, they can basically modify their etc host file, copy this particular IP address. Once you have made this entry, you should be able to see the Nextcloud. What I can probably try here is yeah, if I open this particular IP address, okay, so wait. Right, so I basically need to browse this. Okay, so there is a question. What is the best practice? Do we need to maintain a separate user for Ansible in environment, and do you need sudo access? Okay, you do not need to actually have separate users. Ideally, the thing is that in Ansible, what you need to do is you need to make sure that the person who's executing the Ansible playbook has the permission to do something or not. If the person doesn't have permission to do something, then ideally they should not be doing that. So you should not create a separate user until unless you are also creating a central server, and then you have a separate deployment user altogether. In that case, you can. No password is recommended, but you can, if Ansible has a separate flag to specify sudo passwords in case you do not want to go with no password in your sudo files. So both the methods are supported. Our application is up and running, and you can watch the demo if you can make that entry on your own laptops. As long as you make this particular entry in your laptop, this one, you can probably go and check out the demo. Let me quickly see if I can add. In the meantime, there was one question around inventories. So yeah, if your infrastructure provider, be it a cloud provider or be it a data center provider, if they can expose an API with the list of hosts, then yes, you can basically automate the entire inventory creation procedure. This concept is known as dynamic inventory, whereas you can do the whereas you can call the API of your hosting provider and then populate the inventory dynamically. I think I'm done with the demo. So let's just take up questions. Okay. It would give an idea if you can guide on what to configure in inventory file for local server deployment. If you're doing local server deployment, as in if you are going to set up your own local host and that's it, then I think I've already shown you that. Just have a look at this inventory. You basically need to have this IP. This is the IP of your local host. So as long as you have this in your inventory, your local setup will work. Can we not use Postgres? Yes, you can use Postgres. You can use whatever database. That's not a problem. How many inventory files I can use? You can use as many. Okay. Um, at once, you can use one inventory file. So basically, what best practice I've seen is that people create separate inventory files for separate environments and then call the particular inventory file depending upon the environment on which against which the playbook is supposed to run. Any further network details would be placed into playbook, which no, there is no need of any. I mean, you can place it, but there's no need to have more network details. Can I see the list of supported images and versions? I'm sorry, I didn't get. Are you talking about the DigitalOcean images and versions? In that case, I think DigitalOcean API actually can provide you with a very extensive list of what all is supported. I don't have that list with me right now, but yes. Can I use Ansible to configure cron tab? Yes, there is a specific module called cron tab, and using that particular module, you can actually create crons, delete crons. You can manage the cron end to end. All right, any other questions? Can Ansible manage Git? Yes, there is a Git module for that. So most of my answers are going to be yes, there is a module to do that because Ansible is really, there are hundreds of modules which are maintained by Ansible, and there are a lot of other third-party modules, and you can write your own modules as well. It's very simple Python. They have libraries for various languages. The Python library is basically the simplest one, and you can write your own module if you do not find any module. But for most of the common tasks like Git, cron, managing your cloud provider, managing your package manager, your users, databases, web servers, there are a bunch of modules to do all those things. The module index, which I just showed you, is actually a very good place to do that. If you look at this this module by category, yeah, there are tons of modules to do this. You could set those variables. Yes, I could set those variables in group vars. I could set those variables in host vars. I could set those variables within the roles. Since this is a very introductory session, that's why I've done what was the simplest thing to do here. Can we deploy OS on bare metal? No, unfortunately, you can't do that. You cannot deploy. Ansible will not be able to deploy operating system on bare metal or on anything. Ansible works once you have an active SSH connection. Running Ansible is a one-time task, unlike Puppet. Okay, so there are various things you can do. So what I have shown you right now is basically known as Ansible push mode. In this, what happens is that you can run it from a central or from your local machine, and then that machine connects to the remote and manages them. You can put this in cron if you want. Otherwise, what you can do is you can have something known as Ansible pull mode, wherein each remote machine will call a well-known URL. I mean, you have to configure that. A configurable URL, it's going to pull the Ansible code and then execute that code on itself. That's known as Ansible pull mode. Can Ansible telnet to a networking device? Yes, it can. Basically, you can execute there. I'm pretty sure there might be a module for that, but if there is not, there are shell and command modules which are used to execute ad hoc commands. I hope I've answered all the questions. If there is anything else. All right. All right. If you have anything else, you can always reach out to me and drop me an email. Let me quickly share. Yep, that's my email address. So you can reach out with your Ansible related questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And yeah, if you need, I think that's about it. Thank you for attending.